Hi folks, this is Dr. Rob Cywes. I am the Carb Addiction Doc, and today I'm doing a specific video for a new organization, an umbrella organization, which is called the Society for Metabolic Healthcare Practitioners. And as such, there's a specific issue that I'd like to address that a lot of people are still a victim of. And these are people that are skeptical of low carbohydrate diets. And I think there are two separate concepts there. So today I'm going to discuss some of those concerns and allow you to understand certain of the biologic backgrounds to that and certain of the beliefs, misbeliefs, and misconceptions, so that hopefully you'll have a better favorable understanding of what we're talking about. And I can tell you that I've been working in this space for 21 years. And there is no greater skeptic than myself. I question everything because the answer to the question why is of such critical importance to me. Now, when we talk about low carbohydrate diets, there are three words that we have to analyze. The first one that I just want to put to rest immediately is the word diet. I absolutely hate that word because the word diet has become synonymous with trying to develop or trying a pattern or a program or a nutritional practice that leads to a specific result, whether that's weight loss or improvement in certain conditions. And I think the word diet should be removed as a fundamental word in anything we do nutritionally, unless you want to lose 5 pounds. Outside of that, the word diet should not exist, because if your eating pattern doesn't change to become your way of life, it becomes irrelevant. On any diet, let's say you're going to lose some weight, you want to lose 50 pounds. You go on a diet, you lose the 50 pounds, then what? Diets don't last. Diets are deprivational. Diets require you to tightly control perhaps a relationship you can't control. So stop using the word diet. And let's just start talking about human nutrition. And as we talked about what healthy human nutrition is, we have to look at what is of value to us as well as what is potentially harmful to us as human beings. So the next critically important concept that I want to discuss, which is so often misunderstood, is that carbohydrates are not harmful in any way. Carbohydrates have been necessary for us to survive as a species for many, many years, and there are plenty of examples of hunter-gatherer and early farming societies who do absolutely fine on a super high carbohydrate diet. For example, there's a group of islanders in the Pacific Ocean. I can't remember exactly what the tribal name was, but they subsist on an 80 to 90% carbohydrate caloric diet. They eat a huge amount. They've got over 1,000 different species of sweet potatoes that they live off. Yes, they have pigs, they have goats that give them milk, that give them some animal products, but that's a very small percentage of their diet. So why do they not suffer all the scourges of this terrible thing, this evil component, carbohydrates? Because carbohydrates aren't the problem. The problem, folks, is our modern relationship with carbohydrates. And here's what's happened. We have shifted away from using carbohydrates as a fundamental part of nutrition, like so many hunter-gatherer and even peasant societies do, without harm. The Chinese and Japanese peasants that eat rice is a fundamental. The Irish that eat potatoes. The Africans that eat sorghum and the grains. These islanders that eat the sweet potatoes or the yams. And yet they're perfectly healthy from all the diseases that the modern Western diet provides to us. So what's the difference? The issue is not carbohydrates, folks. The primary issue that our relationship with carbohydrates has evolved. We've shifted away from using carbohydrates as a fundamental staple for nutritional value, for energy, caloric, and nutritional value, toward using sugar and starch primarily as a drug to manage our emotional needs. And it is as much the use of sugar and starch for its emotion management, for the endorphin high that it gives us, that is the problem. So don't demonize carbohydrates because our relationship with it has become dysfunctional. Alcohol is a very valuable substance for some people. But if you're an alcoholic, it's your relationship with alcohol that's the problem. So make that change in your way of thinking and you'll understand this a little bit better. And that is so, so important to avoiding skepticism that carbohydrates are bad. But understand you and your patients may have a toxic relationship with the substance. And then we have to deal with it from a substance abuse perspective rather than a dietary limitation perspective. And that is so important also, is that what has sprung up because we've recognized the dangers of chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption is all these keto cults and all the keto evangelists have sprung up and say, oh, they've demonized they've gone carnivore. No, folks. We do have to understand what chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption does do to the human body. But to demonize carbohydrates in a cult-like fashion is as toxic as any cult-like diet, whether it's veganism or the fruitarians. We have to understand carbohydrates and recognize their value and their illness, the illness that they cause. And this is really what got me into this from a carbohydrate skeptic. I was working with a guy, with a group of folks in Toronto who, for example, created the glycemic index in 1981, David Jenkins. He was on my Ph.D. committee. And we were looking at the value of carbohydrates in livers during the transplantation process. And what we found, paradoxically, is that the carbohydrates served a benefit for a very, very low concentration to the transplanted liver. But very rapidly, the greater the carbohydrate concentration, the greater the damage. And that didn't sit well with us because how can that be possible? We've always understood that more carbohydrates are healthy. And then when we analyzed those liver specimens, we found that the high concentrations of carbohydrates that we were able to supply to those organs created endothelial damage. And those damaged endothelial cells basically broke apart, and that left an exposed underlying basement membrane that is very procoagulant. And blood clots formed there. And the blood clots then had fibrin clots that attracted activated platelets, that attracted activated lymphocytes, that finally attracted the deposition of fat into those clots to stabilize them. And that, folks, is the true role that fat plays in cardiovascular disease. It isn't fat that initiates, it isn't lipids, it isn't LDL that initiates the damage. The damage comes from massively high levels of carbohydrates in the bloodstream, spikes and also continuously elevated levels. And that creates the original injury. The lipids are responding to the injury, not causal to the injury. And yet this whole industry of lipidology and lipid damage has been built on the misunderstanding of that very concept. If you feed somebody fat without carbohydrates, the vascular membrane is intact. The integrity of the vascular membrane is not harmed by the consumption of a high-fat diet. But a high-carbohydrate diet, particularly when it tends toward diabetes, is very toxic to the endothelial cells. And I demonstrated that endothelial injury in my PhD, but we've so shifted toward lipophobia that we won't even consider the role of carbohydrates. Especially carbohydrate overdosing. If you think of carbohydrates as a drug, I use morphine in surgery all the time. But if you're on the street squirting up heroin, that's a whole different concept to opioid use. In exactly the same way, some carbohydrates may have value, but it's chronic excessive carbohydrate overdosing as a drug that causes the harm. Don't demonize the carbohydrates, understand the mental health pattern. The next factor is that polyunsaturated fats and carbohydrates do not exist in combination in nature. Polyunsaturated fats, seed oils, and polyunsaturated fats, together with carbohydrates, do not exist in nature, but they exist in modern mechanized manufactured human food. And that is the greatest demon of them all. They taste fantastic. We love them. They're quick and easy. They maintain food in a very easily consumed fashion that doesn't even need refrigeration or heating. And it is our drug-addicted relationship with that combination, we call it junk food, we call it a variety of things, that has created the problem. It isn't carbohydrates as they occur in nature. It is that conversion from eating carbohydrates for their nutritional value to using them as a drug, to using them as an instant resource, that has created the problem. And if you're going to be skeptical about carbohydrates, I don't think anybody can be skeptical about the fact that fat, that cookies, that baked products cause us harm. It's pretty darn obvious. Okay? And really the focus here is on the chronic excessive use of sugar. It isn't even on the high fat side. There's value to the high fat side, but I'm not even going to address that in this discussion on carbohydrate skepticism. And we have to look at the diseases of high carbohydrate consumption. And the disease initially comes from the elevated levels of sugar in the bloodstream. Clearly, that is toxic to the endothelial cells. We call those disease processes diabetes, atherosclerosis, cardiovascular disease, strokes. Those are the intravascular diseases that come directly from chronically elevated levels of sugar, including edema, fluid retention, hypertension, those kinds of diseases. However, there's a secondary trigger that most people are not even absolutely aware of, let alone recognize. And that is that under conditions of chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption, it affects insulin production by the liver, by the pancreas, and use by the liver. Insulin is there to clear excess sugar from the bloodstream. But when your insulin levels are chronically elevated, insulin has critical other functions in the human body. It regulates protein synthesis, it regulates steroid hormone synthesis, and it regulates cholesterol synthesis. And that is related to the ebb and flow of insulin levels during meals, shortly thereafter, and then for long periods of time where we don't eat. When our insulin levels are chronically elevated, we get protein synthesis dysfunction. At a transcriptional level, we get cholesterol dysfunction, production dysfunction, and we get steroid hormone dysfunction. That has nothing directly to do with carbohydrates other than chronic excessive eating and chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption triggers hyperinsulinemia. And it is that hyperinsulinemia that is as much part of the illness profile of metabolic syndrome as the sugar itself is. So understanding that and recognizing and doing some reading and research about the effects of hyperinsulinemia may help you to change your mind about being skeptical of low carbohydrate way of lives. And that's the point, is don't think of this as a diet. It's not just something you do, because of course you are not going to sustain this as a way of life for a long period of time. You don't have to do it instantly, and you don't have to do it perfectly for it to become a way of life. This is a slow process of successful change. And change occurs in certain stages. There's a contemplative phase, there's a preparation phase, then there's an action phase. It may take you a few months to decrease carbohydrates from your diet. And it's by elimination slowly of categories, not doing it all at once. Don't start a low carb or a keto diet on one day. Ease your way into it, because the body reacts very poorly to sudden abrupt changes. The analogy that I use is, don't suddenly go and put diesel in a gasoline car and expect it to run properly. No, you have to rebuild the engine. And the same with the human body. So some of the failures we've seen of sudden changes to low carb that have created a huge red warning and a risk for low carb diets is because people did it suddenly. If you slowly reduce carbohydrate consumption by category, maybe getting rid of the sugar in your drinks, then getting rid of potatoes and rice, and then maybe getting rid of some of the snacks and the sugary treats. Slowly over time, over a few months, you can recondition your body, and then you see all the health benefits without the liability. But crashing into a carbohydrate diet as a crash diet, of course it's going to create massive metabolic disruption. And if you see the massive metabolic disruption, it's very easy to be skeptical of a low carbohydrate diet. But if you see this as a slow progressive change in a way of life, then it becomes easy to embrace this as a highly positive way to go through things. But also understand the direct toxicity of sugar as well as the direct toxicity of hyperinsulinemia. And understand what it means to look at insulin levels as a marker of disease autonomously. We typically don't look at insulin because we don't have a drug to treat it. But we have a methodology to treat it, which is slowly lowering carbohydrate consumption. And it is that hyperinsulinemia that is primarily responsible for metabolic syndrome. The final piece is to understand why people overdose on carbohydrates as a way of life. No different than alcoholism, crystal meth utilization, smoking. Carbohydrates have a highly immediate endorphin triggering effect. They make us feel great. And the reason for that is because there used to be survival advantage attached to it. Just like sex is a wonderful endorphin experience because procreation was so important to the species. And it still is. It still is. But we've misappropriated that high that we get from eating carbohydrates, and we use it in a dysfunctional way for emotion management, to the detriment of using other mechanisms, healthier mechanisms of emotion management. And we use carbohydrates as a drug to get high. And when you do that, you use it in a chronic, excessive way, no different than smoking cigarettes or alcohol, and over time that causes harm. So understanding why people overdose on carbohydrates and overuse them is important. Don't demonize carbohydrates, but examine the relationship, examine the effect of hyperinsulinemia, and understand what those two things are doing to the human body. And then your skepticism may change to say, maybe there's some validity to reducing how much carbohydrate we eat. And once you understand that, and you start to do that in practice, and you start to see the tremendous benefits, when you see people's diabetes go into remission, normal A1Cs off medication, when you see their metabolic syndrome go away, when you see their hypertension normalize, when you see them lose and keep massive amounts of weight off. That's the experiment we want you to do. And once you start to see that, just like I've done for 21 years, supremely skeptical. How can this wonderful thing called sugar and starch be bad for me? But every day in my office, within my own life and within the lives of my patients, I prove over and over and over again that metabolic disease eradication is feasible without medications that really don't help us as much as removing the drug that caused the problem in the first place. And understanding that, and understanding that we also have to replace a person's relationship with themselves and with better, healthier emotion management strategies, to replace that role of carbohydrates, not only from a nutritional perspective, but from an emotion management perspective, then you understand the low-carb way of life as being a healthier way of life and not being harmful. I hope this message helps you to think. I understand your skepticism. I understand that there's so much noise out there, as much by the keto evangelists and the low-carb evangelists as by the pro-fat, pro-vegetarian, Being on a low-carbohydrate doesn't mean you can't be a vegan or a vegetarian or a carnivore or anything in between. But it's using sugar and starch as a drug rather than as a food that is the problem and is the common denominator for so many of our modern metabolic health issues, from Alzheimer's to autism, from cancer to autoimmune disease. Make a low-carb approach part of your practice of disease treatment, and you will see extraordinary results. Do the experiment, even if you're skeptical. Do the experiment on yourself, on some of your patients, but ease into it over time. Think of it like ramping up a medication slowly. You start with a low dose and you slowly increase the dose. Do exactly the same thing with carbohydrate withdrawal. Do it slowly over time by category, and you will see the results without the harm and the sustainability. And hopefully that'll convert your skepticism into one of optimism that you can be a real doctor and treat diseases that patients cause themselves into remission.